The relentless sun of the Nevada Territory in the late spring of 1874 beat down upon the scrubland with an oppressive weight, turning the air into a shimmering curtain of heat that distorted the horizon. In this unforgiving landscape, where the boundary between life and death was often decided by a single misstep or an empty canteen, Mei Lin moved with the practiced grace of someone who respected the land rather than sought to conquer it. She was miles from the small, isolated settlement of Chinese laborers and their families that huddled near the base of the Iron Ridge, a community bound together by shared heritage and the shared burden of exclusion. Mei Lin, however, found solace in the solitude of the open plains, gathering sage and wild onions, her eyes scanning the ground while her mind drifted to the impossible vastness of this new world. It was during this silent reverie that the sound of a desperate, terrifying whinny shattered the stillness, echoing off the canyon walls like a cry for help from the earth itself. Mei Lin froze, her instincts sharpening as she dropped her basket and ran toward a dry creek bed known to locals as the Devil's Gullet. The sight that greeted her was one of nightmare and tragedy. A magnificent bay horse was already chest-deep in a treacherous sinkhole of churning mud and quicksand, its eyes wide with panic, thrashing in a way that only hastened its demise. Beside the beast, struggling to keep his head above the suffocating mire, was a man, a cowboy, his hat floating just out of reach, his face smeared with grit and terror. He was thrashing, his leather chaps weighing him down, the relentless suction of the earth claiming him inch by inexorable inch. This was Arthur, though Mei Lin did not know his name then. She only saw a human soul on the precipice of being swallowed whole by the unforgiving land. The cowboy shouted, his voice hoarse and cracking, words lost to the panic, but the plea in his eyes transcended language. Mei Lin did not hesitate. The fear that usually governed interactions between her people and the white settlers evaporated in the face of immediate mortality. She scanned the bank, her mind racing, spotting a thick, gnarled root of a mesquite tree protruding from the hard-packed earth near the edge of the pit. Uncoiling the length of braided hemp rope she used for binding firewood, she anchored herself against the root, her small frame tense with determination. She cast the line with a prayer on her lips, the rope singing through the dry air before landing, with a splash near Arthur's flailing hand. The rescue was not a moment of swift glory, but a grueling, agonizing battle against physics and exhaustion. Arthur, his strength nearly spent, managed to wrap the rough hemp around his wrist, his knuckles white, his breath coming in ragged gasps that shook his entire submerged frame. Mei Lin pulled, her boots digging furrows into the red dirt, the muscles of her arms screaming in protest as she leveraged every ounce of her weight against the greedy pull of the quicksand. Minutes felt like hours. The sun hammered down on them, indifferent to the struggle, sweat stinging Mei Lin's eyes as she gritted her teeth, refusing to let go, refusing to let the earth win. She could hear Arthur groaning, a guttural sound of exertion, as he fought to drag his torso free from the sludge. Slowly, agonizingly, the mud relinquished its hold with a sickening squelch. First his shoulders, then his waist, and finally, with one last, desperate heave that sent them both tumbling backward onto the solid, baking earth, he was free. They lay there for a long time, the only sound the ragged rhythm of their breathing and the buzzing of cicadas, two strangers from warring worlds united by the fragile miracle of survival. As the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the aching throb of overexerted muscles, Arthur pushed himself up to a seated position, wiping the mud from his face to reveal striking blue eyes that held a mixture of shock and profound gratitude. He looked at Mei Lin, really looked at her, perhaps seeing her for the first time, not as a foreigner or phantom of the periphery, but as a savior. Mei Lin, clutching her bruised hands to her chest, met his gaze with a stoic dignity, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. There was a dangerous intimacy in the silence that stretched between them, a recognition of shared humanity that stripped away the prejudices of the era. Arthur reached for his canteen, which had miraculously survived the fall, and with trembling hands he offered it to her first. It was a gesture of supreme honor in the desert, Water was life, and to offer it before drinking oneself was a pledge of respect. Mei Lin hesitated, then accepted the battered tin vessel, the cool water soothing her parched throat. When she handed it back, their fingers brushed, a spark of contact that felt hotter than the midday sun. I am Arthur," he rasped, his voice rough with thirst and emotion. He tapped his chest, leaving a smudge of mud on his torn shirt. Mei Lin nodded slowly, understanding the intent, if not all the words. "Mei Lin," she whispered, the syllables soft against the harsh landscape. Arthur fumbled in his pocket, searching for something, his expression desperate to bridge the gap between them, to offer something more than words which held little currency. He pulled out a heavy silver ring, set with a piece of deep blue turquoise, a talisman of the Southwest that clearly held value beyond its weight. He reached out and gently took Mei Lin's hand, pressing the ring into her palm and closing her fingers over it. His hands were large, calloused, and warm. Her hand looked small and porcelain fragile within his grasp, yet he knew the strength that lay within it. "For my life," he said, his eyes intense and earnest, locking onto hers with a gravitational pull that frightened and thrilled her in equal measure. She tried to refuse, shaking her head, but he was insistent, closing his hands over hers again. It was a moment of suspended reality, a romantic tension blooming amidst the dust and danger, a silent vow that this encounter would not be forgotten. He could not stay, and neither could she. The sun was beginning its descent, and to be found together would invite ruin for them both. Arthur mounted his horse, which had managed to scramble free during the chaos, and looked back at her one last time, a salute of silent reverence before turning west toward the ranch lands. Mei Lin walked back to the settlement as the sky turned a bruised purple, the silver ring heavy and hidden deep within the folds of her sash. The familiar scents of boiling rice, star anise, and the metallic tang of the nearby railway tracks greeted her, usually a comfort, but tonight they felt like the bars of a cage. She moved through the narrow alleys between the canvas tents and rough-hewn shacks, keeping her head down, terrifyingly aware of the secret she carried. The settlement was a place of high walls, not built of stone, but of fear and necessary isolation. Her father, Chen, a man whose face was etched with the hardships of 2 continents, sat by the communal fire, sharpening a tool. He looked up as she approached, his eyes narrowing slightly as he noted the disarray of her clothing and the mud on her hem. "The spirits of the plain are restless," Chen murmured in their native tongue, a statement that was both observation and warning. Mei Lin nodded, her throat tight. "The heat makes fools of us all, father," she replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. She did not tell him of the cowboy. She did not tell him of the blue eyes that had looked at her with such raw vulnerability. To do so would be to invite panic. The relationship between the Chinese laborers and the local cattlemen was fraught with peril. A misunderstanding could spark a massacre, and a Chinese woman touching a white man, even to save his life, could be twisted into a crime by the hateful rhetoric of the time. That night, Mei Lin lay on her pallet, turning the silver ring over and over in the darkness. The turquoise stone felt cool against her skin, a tangible proof that the afternoon had been real. She felt a strange, terrifying hope unfurl in her chest, a belief that perhaps the barriers between their peoples were not as insurmountable as they seemed. But outside, the wind howled through the canyon, sounding like the whisper of gathering ghosts. Before we continue this tale of forbidden connection and the storm that is about to break, if you believe that courage can bridge even the widest divides, please take a moment to subscribe and like this video. Your support helps us bring these lost legends to life. Now, back to the story, where the consequences of Mei Lin's mercy are about to descend upon the village. 3 days passed, and the heat did not break. It hung over the valley like a curse, fraying nerves and shortening tempers. In the settlement, the air was thick with unease. It wasn't just the weather. There was a shift in the atmosphere, a vibration in the ground that the elders claimed to feel in their bones. Rumors began to drift in from the railway lines, whispers of a gathering at the Circle K ranch, of men arming themselves, of agitated shouting and the cleaning of rifles. The laborers worked with their heads down, eyes darting toward the horizon, expecting the worst. Maylene moved through her chores like a ghost, her heart sinking with every passing hour. Had she made a mistake? Had Arthur died of his ordeal after he left her, and was his disappearance now being blamed on her people? Or worse, had he told them of her, and they were coming to exact some twisted form of justice? The silver ring burned against her skin where she kept it hidden, no longer a token of gratitude, but a brand of potential doom. She imagined Arthur's face, trying to reconcile the gentle gratitude she had seen with the violent reputation of his kin. The romantic spark she had felt now seemed like a dangerous delusion. She watched her father, Chin, organizing the men, not for work, but for defense. They had no guns, only pickaxes, shovels, and the strength of their desperation. "The wind carries the scent of iron and horses," Chin said on the third evening, his voice grim. "The foreign devils are coming." Maylin wanted to speak, to confess, to say that she had saved one of them, that perhaps there was a debt of honor that would protect them, but fear choked her. What if her action was the very thing that had drawn their gaze? She realized with a sinking dread that the hero's journey she had unwittingly embarked upon was entering its darkest chapter. She was the bridge between these two worlds, but bridges are often the first things burned when war begins. She stood at the edge of the camp, looking toward the west, praying to ancestors she hadn't spoken to in years, asking for a miracle that seemed increasingly impossible. Then it happened. It started as a low rumble, distinct from the thunder of the summer storms. It was rhythmic, heavy, and growing louder with every heartbeat. The ground beneath Maylene's feet began to tremble, sending dust motes dancing into the stagnant air. From the ridge to the west, a dark line appeared against the setting sun, growing rapidly into a terrifying cloud of dust and motion. Panic erupted in the settlement. Mothers grabbed their children, pulling them into the flimsy safety of the tents. Men shouted, grabbing their tools, forming a jagged, fragile line of defense at the entrance of the camp. Maylene stood frozen, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The cloud of dust resolved itself into riders. Dozens of them. No, not dozens. 100. 100 armed men on horseback, silhouetted against the blood-red sky, galloping directly toward them with the unstoppable force of a landslide. The noise was deafening, the thunder of hooves, the jingling of spurs and bridles, the shouts of men. It was an invasion force. As they drew closer, the details became sharp and terrifying. The glint of Winchester rifles in scabbards, the grim set of jaws, the sheer overwhelming power of the cavalry. At the very front of the formation, riding a fresh black stallion, was a figure Maylene recognized instantly. It was Arthur. He looked different now, cleaned up, wearing a fresh coat, a Stetson pulled low over his eyes, and a revolver strapped to his hip. He did not look like the vulnerable man she had pulled from the mud. He looked like a warlord leading a charge. A cry of despair went up from the village. Chen stepped forward, gripping a heavy iron pry bar, ready to die for his home. But Maylene moved faster, driven by a desperate instinct, a belief in the spark she had felt 3 days ago. She broke from the line of laborers. "No!" she screamed, though her voice was swallowed by the roar of the approaching horses. She ran out into the open ground, placing herself directly in the path of the stampede, a lone, slender figure standing between the hammer and the anvil. She raised her hand, the sunlight catching the silver ring she now wore openly on her finger, flashing like a beacon. The riders were bearing down on her, huge and terrifying, and for a heartbeat she thought she would be trampled into the dust, a tragic footnote in a violent history. The ground shook with a violence that rattled the teeth of every soul in the settlement, the thunder of 400 hooves creating a cacophony that drowned out the frantic prayers of the elders. Maylene stood immovable in the center of the swirling dust, her small figure a singular point of stillness against the oncoming storm of leather and iron. The lead horse, Arthur's massive black stallion, reared back at the last possible second, its hooves slicing the air just feet from her face, the animal's nostrils flaring red with exertion. Behind him, the wall of riders pulled their mounts to a chaotic, grinding halt, a wave of motion crashing against an invisible barrier of courage. The air was thick with the acrid smell of sweat, horsehair, and fear, choking the lungs and stinging the eyes. Silence did not fall immediately. It was a gradual, terrifying cessation of noise, replaced by the heavy breathing of the animals and the ominous creak of saddle leather. The laborers cowered behind the thin canvas of their tents, peeking out with eyes wide in anticipation of the slaughter, while Chin, Malin's father, stood 10 paces behind her, his knuckles white around the iron bar, his face a mask of agonized helplessness. He shouted her name, a raw sound of paternal terror, but she did not turn. Her gaze was locked upward, past the flared nostrils of the beast, to the man who sat in the saddle, looming over her like a judgment from the heavens. Arthur looked down at her, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat, his expression unreadable. For a long, suffocating moment, no one moved. The tension was a physical weight, pressing down on the valley, brittle enough to snap with a single sudden gesture. A cowboy to Arthur's left, a man with a scarred lip and eyes hard as flint, rested his hand conspicuously on the butt of his revolver, his gaze flicking contemptuously toward the cowering villagers. "Give the word, boss," he muttered, his voice carrying in the unnatural quiet. "We can clear this patch of dirt in 10 minutes." The threat hung in the air, naked and ugly. Maylene's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she did not flinch. She raised her chin, the silver ring on her finger catching the last dying rays of the sun, a silent challenge to the man she had saved. She was gambling everything, her life, her father's life, the survival of her entire community, on the character of a man she had known for only an hour in the mud. She saw a flicker in Arthur's blue eyes, a softening that warred with the hard lines of his face. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand, not to signal an attack, but to command silence from his own men. He swung his leg over the saddle horn and dropped to the ground, his boots hitting the dust with a heavy thud that echoed like a gavel strike. He walked toward her, towering over her slight frame, the dust swirling around his long duster coat. The distance between them felt like a canyon, bridged only by the memory of the rope and the gripping mud. When he stopped, he was close enough that she could smell the tobacco and sage on his clothes, close enough to see the exhaustion etched around his eyes. He slowly removed his hat, a gesture of respect that sent a ripple of shock through the watching riders and the hidden villagers alike. In the Old West, a white man did not uncover his head for a Chinese laborer. It was an overturning of the natural order, a defiance of every social law that governed the territory. "I told you," Arthur said, his voice deep and resonating with a strange mixture of authority and tenderness, "that a debt of life is not paid with silver alone." He turned from her, facing his confused and restless men, and then looked past them to the terrified faces of the villagers. "3 days ago, this woman pulled me from the Devil's Gullet when my own horse was ready to trample me," Arthur announced, his voice booming across the settlement. "She risked the quicksand, and she risked your fear to save a stranger. Today, the Circle K rides not for war, but for honor." A murmur of confusion rippled through the line of mounted men. They had ridden out on Arthur's orders, expecting a dispute over water rights or a show of force against squatters. Not this. Arthur signaled to the rear of the column, and the wall of horses parted. From the back, 3 heavy wagons rumbled forward, their axles groaning under a significant weight. They were not loaded with ammunition or dynamite, but with sacks of flour, crates of dried beef, barrels of fresh water, and high-quality timber, supplies that the isolated Chinese community had been systematically denied by the local merchants. The revelation hit the settlement with the force of a physical blow. The fear that had gripped the laborers began to fracture, replaced by a stunned, fragile disbelief. Arthur turned back to Maylin, his eyes searching hers for acceptance. "You gave me back my future," he said softly, for her ears alone. "I cannot change the world, Maylin, but I can ensure your people do not starve this summer." Tears pricked Maylin's eyes, hot and sudden. It was a gesture of unprecedented magnitude, a localized miracle in a land that was usually stingy with mercy. She looked at the wagons, then back to Arthur, and for the first time, a genuine smile broke through her mask of stoicism. However, peace is rarely seized without challenge, and the prejudices of the frontier ran deep, festering like an untreated wound. The man with the scarred lip, whose name was Harlan, spurred his horse forward, blocking the path of the lead wagon. He was a man built of grit and bitterness, a veteran of border skirmishes who saw the world in stark, unforgiving binaries. "Hold it!" Harlan barked, his hand dropping once more to his gun belt. The sound of the hammer clicking back was deafening in the silence. "I didn't ride 20 miles to play nursemaid to a bunch of railroad rats, Arthur. You said we had business. This ain't business. This is charity for the enemy." The atmosphere instantly curdled, the tentative hope evaporating into renewed terror. The other riders shifted uneasily, some murmuring in agreement with Harlan. The racial divide was a chasm that a few sacks of flour could not easily fill. Chin, seeing the gun, rushed forward to shield his daughter, grabbing her arm to pull her back, his face pale with the certainty of violence. "Go back, Mei Lin," he hissed. "They will kill us all." Arthur did not flinch, nor did he turn to look at his second-in-command immediately. He held Mei Lin's gaze for a second longer, a silent promise, before slowly pivoting to face Harlan. The transformation in his demeanor was terrifying. The gentle gratitude vanished, replaced by the cold, lethal focus of a man who had survived the lawless plains for a decade. "The enemy, Harlan?" Arthur asked, his voice deceptively soft, dangerously low. "The only enemy here is the land itself. It tries to kill us every day. Sun, drought, snakes, quicksand." He took a step toward the mounted man, his hand hanging loose near his own holster, not drawing, but ready. "This woman fought the land for me. She won. If you have a problem with me paying a debt of honor, then you have a problem with me. And if you have a problem with me, you can step down off that horse and settle it." The challenge was absolute. It was a test of leadership and a test of the code of the West. Harlan glared down, his finger hovering over the trigger, his pride warring with his survival instinct. He looked at Arthur's unyielding stance, then at the other men, who were watching their boss with a growing sense of awe. To shoot his employer over a wagon of flour would be mutiny. To back down was humiliation. The wind whistled through the gap between them, kicking up dust devils that danced around the horses' hooves. Mei Lin watched, her breath caught in her throat. She realized then that this was not just about flour or gratitude. It was a battle for the soul of these men, a choice between the easy brutality of their time and the harder, higher path of humanity. Arthur did not blink. "Holster it, Harlan," Arthur commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. "Or ride out, alone." The tension held for a heartbeat longer, agonizing and sharp, until Harlan spat into the dirt, uncocked his revolver, and jerked his reins, turning his horse away from the wagons but remaining in the line. He would not leave, but he had been cowed. The breath rushed out of the settlement in a collective sigh. Arthur turned back to the wagons and nodded. "Unload them," he ordered. This time the men moved. The next hour was a blur of surreal cooperation, a meeting of two worlds that had existed in parallel but separate universes until this moment. Under the command of Arthur and the watchful, astounded eyes of Chin, the cowboys dismounted and began to haul the heavy sacks and timber into the center of the settlement. The Chinese men, initially paralyzed, slowly stepped forward to help, their movements tentative at first, then gaining confidence as the work found a rhythm. There was no common language for many of them, but the language of labor was universal. A grunt of exertion, a nod of thanks, a hand steadied, these became the words of their diplomacy. Mei Lin stood in the center of it all, the axis upon which this impossible evening turned. Arthur found her there, amidst the dust and the noise. He did not touch her. To do so would still be too dangerous in front of so many eyes, but he stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "You have done a great thing," Mei Lin said, her English heavily accented but clear, her voice trembling with the weight of her emotions. She looked at the supplies, which would ensure her village could withstand the coming dry season. "You have saved us." Arthur shook his head, looking at the ring on her finger. "We are even, Mei Lin. Just even." But his eyes told a different story. They spoke of a connection that went deeper than debts, a profound recognition of a kindred spirit found in the most unlikely of places. The romance between them was not one of stolen kisses or whispered poetry, but of shared strength. It was a stoic, burning thing, made of glances and the heavy silence of things that could not be said. He watched her with a reverence that made her flush, a look that said he would remember her face until the day he died. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, casting long shadows that merged the figures of the cowboys and the laborers into one indistinguishable shape on the ground. As the last crate was stacked and the wagon stood empty, a new fire was lit in the center of the camp, not a signal of alarm, but a hearth of community. For a brief, shining hour, the barriers of race and language dissolved under the influence of shared food and the relief of averted disaster. But the reality of 1874 was inexorable. As the stars began to wheel overhead, Arthur whistled for his men to mount up. The dream had to end. They could not stay. The world outside this valley was still cruel, and prolonged contact would only invite trouble from the law or other ranchers. Arthur mounted his black stallion, looking down at Maylin one last time. The air between them crackled with the tragedy of their separation. He touched the brim of his hat, a final salute. "Be safe, Maylin," he murmured. "I will be," she replied, clutching the silver ring, "because I know there is honor in the hills now." He turned his horse and galloped away, his 100 men following in his wake, the thunder of their departure fading into the night until it was just a vibration in the earth. Maylene stood watching long after they were gone, the dust settling around her feet. She knew she would likely never see him again. Their lives ran on different tracks, destined never to fully merge. Yet, as she looked at her father, who was inspecting a sack of flour with tears in his eyes, and at the villagers who were sleeping without fear for the first time in months, she knew that the bond remained. The story of the Chinese woman and the cowboy would be whispered around fires for generations, a legend of a bridge built over a chasm of hate, held together by a rope, a ring, and a single act of courage. And before you go, remember that history is full of these hidden moments of connection. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it with others. The darkness of the past was deep, but the lights of individual kindness shone all the brighter within it.